CFA Level 1 Practice Questions. Learning Module, Introduction to Geopolitics. Topic, National Governments and Political Cooperation. When a national government is engaged in a high-stakes territorial conflict, how does this typically affect its willingness to cooperate politically with other nations? A. The government increases cooperation with all nations to build a united front against the adversary. B. The government reduces cooperation with nations perceived as adversaries or neutral, due to higher perceived costs. C. The government suspends all diplomatic relations until the conflict is resolved. Which of the following best illustrates the use of soft power in international relations? A nation providing scholarships for foreign students to study its language and culture. B. A government imposing tariffs on imports to protect domestic industries. C. A country threatening sanctions to alter another state's policy decisions. Conflict elevates national security above economic or diplomatic interests. Cooperation is reduced because engaging with adversaries or neutral states introduces strategic risks, such as compromised intelligence or shifting allegiances. A. Fails because cooperation narrows to allies only, not expands indiscriminately. Engaging adversaries or neutrals weakens strategic leverage. C. Fails because complete diplomatic isolation is counterproductive. Limited ties remain essential for negotiation, aid, and maintaining global influence. Soft power operates through attraction and persuasion, not coercion. Cultural and educational exchanges build long-term goodwill and influence by creating positive perceptions rather than forcing compliance. B fails because tariffs are coercive economic tools that pressure through penalties, creating resentment rather than voluntary alignment. C fails because sanctions rely on fear and compulsion to change behavior, which is characteristic of hard power, not soft power. Topic, Forces of Globalization. Which of the following is most directly linked to the geopolitical risks of globalization rollback? A. The rise of e-commerce platforms reducing cross-border trade barriers. B. A major economy imposing tariffs on imported goods to protect domestic industries. Multinational corporation opening a new factory in a developing country. Which of the following developments best illustrates a political consequence arising from the costs of globalization? A. Increased cross-border collaboration on renewable energy innovation. B. Rising populist movements opposing free trade and immigration policies. C. Expansion of multinational corporations into new foreign markets. Which of the following situations best illustrates how globalization can increase a country's vulnerability to geopolitical risk? A nation maintains strict trade barriers to protect its domestic industries. B. A country with deep trade and financial linkages faces market turmoil, following sanctions on one of its key trading partners. C. A small, resource-rich country experiences stable growth through limited foreign engagement. Which of the following is most consistent with a non-financial motivation for participating in globalization? A. Learning innovative management techniques through cross-cultural exposure. B. Relocating factories abroad to lower labor expenses. C. Negotiating trade agreements to expand export markets. Tariffs are a direct policy tool that restricts cross-border trade, representing nationalism and the weaponization of interdependence, which fragments global production and weakens institutions like the WTO. A. Fails because e-commerce reduces trade friction and deepens economic interdependence, accelerating, rather than reversing globalization. C. Fails because foreign direct investment expands global supply chains and international production, which reflects continued globalization rather than rollback. Globalization creates economic costs such as job losses and wage stagnation, which generate public resentment. Populist movements emerge as a political backlash against these costs, prioritizing nationalism over international cooperation. A. Fails because cross-border collaboration on renewable energy is a benefit of globalization, not a political consequence arising from its costs. C. Fails because multinational expansion is an economic driver of globalization, not a political reaction. The question asks for the political outcome, backlash, not the economic mechanism that triggers it. Deep trade and financial linkages create interdependence, which becomes a channel for transmitting geopolitical shocks. Sanctions or instability in a trading partner can trigger financial turmoil and operational disruption in the interconnected country, even without direct involvement in the conflict. A. Fails because maintaining trade barriers is a deliberate policy to reduce exposure to external shocks, insulating rather than increasing vulnerability. This is a choice to limit globalization, not a vulnerability created by it. C. Fails because limited foreign engagement means fewer channels for shock transmission. Stability from domestic resource control does not illustrate how globalization creates vulnerability. Instead, it reflects the absence of globalization. Non-financial motivations focus on intangible benefits, such as knowledge acquisition, skill development, and cultural enrichment. These represent intrinsic gain, where the driver is personal or organizational growth, rather than profit. B. Fails because relocating factories to lower labor expenses is a cost reduction strategy aimed at increasing profit margins, which is a financial motivation. C. Fails because negotiating trade agreements to expand export markets is revenue-driven, focused on financial gains, such as export volumes and economic growth. Non-financial motivations center on intangible benefits like learning and innovation, whereas financial motivations center on cost savings, revenue, and profit maximization. Topic: International trade organizations. Which of the following situations best reflects the role of the International Monetary Fund, IMF? A developing country seeks long-term funding for infrastructure to promote sustainable growth. B. A nation facing a severe balance of payments crisis receives conditional lending to stabilize its currency. C. A group of nations forms a trade pact to reduce tariffs and improve cross-border commerce. The IMF's core role is acting as a lender of last resort for countries facing balance of payments crises. Its lending is conditional on economic reforms to restore stability, focusing on short-term financial stabilization rather than long-term development. A. Fails because long-term infrastructure funding is the mandate of the World Bank, not the IMF. The IMF addresses short-term crises, not development financing. C. Fails because forming trade pacts falls under the WTO or regional trade blocs. The IMF monitors macroeconomic impacts of trade, but does not negotiate trade agreements. IMF handles financial stabilization and crisis lending. World Bank handles long-term development. WTO handles trade liberalization and dispute resolution. Topic: Assessing geopolitical actors and risk. Which of the following country behaviors best illustrates multilateralism? A. Regional power forming individual trade agreements to strengthen its national influence. B. Several nations cooperating under a shared institutional framework to coordinate global climate policy. C. A dominant country using its economic leverage to unilaterally dictate trade rules to smaller partners. A country actively forms one-on-one trade and investment agreements with selected partners, but avoids joining large international organizations. Which archetype best describes this behavior? A. Bilateralism. B. Multilateralism. C. Autarky. Multilateralism involves three or more countries cooperating under a shared institutional framework. It is rules-based, collective, and addresses global issues through shared governance, rather than power hierarchies or selective arrangements. A. Fails because forming individual one-on-one agreements describes bilateralism, which is driven by national interests and is transactional, rather than collective or institution-based. C. Fails because a dominant country dictating trade rules unilaterally describes hegemony, which relies on coercion and hierarchical control, the opposite of multilateralism's equality and collective decision-making. Bilateralism involves direct one-on-one agreements with selected partners, prioritizing flexibility and sovereignty over broad institutional rules. The country avoids large international organizations to maintain control over customized deals tailored to its national interests. B fails because multilateralism requires participation in large international organizations, with harmonized rules among many partners. The country explicitly avoids such institutions, which is the opposite of multilateralism. C fails because autarky means economic self-sufficiency, with minimal or no external engagement. The country is actively forming trade and investment agreements, which contradicts autarky's goal of isolation. Topic: The tools of geopolitics. Which of the following actions best demonstrates the use of a multifaceted geopolitical tool to advance national interests? A country enters a joint infrastructure agreement requiring shared security and trade standards. B. A nation imposes unilateral tariffs on imported consumer goods. C. A government deploys military forces to occupy a disputed border region. Which of the following geopolitical tools is most consistent with fostering economic integration and cross-border cooperation? A. Regional free trade zones that eliminate tariffs among member countries. B. Strategic tariffs imposed to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. C. Currency controls restricting international capital movement. Which of the following examples best illustrates how a country may use a financial tool to achieve geopolitical objectives? A. Imposing currency sanctions that freeze the assets of a foreign government. B. Establishing a customs union to encourage regional trade integration. C. Creating a joint defense pact to ensure mutual security. A country decides to nationalize foreign-owned energy assets after diplomatic negotiations with trading partners fail. This action most likely represents A. Political non-cooperation motivated by national self-interest. B. Multilateral coordination to stabilize resource markets. C. Bilateral engagement to attract foreign investment. A multifaceted geopolitical tool combines economic, political, and security objectives into a single strategy. Joint infrastructure with shared security and trade standards integrates multiple dimensions, enhancing trade, strengthening alliances, and establishing mutual defense, requiring negotiation and mutual benefit rather than unilateral action. B fails because unilateral tariffs are a purely economic tool focused on protectionism. They lack political or security integration, may trigger retaliation, and damage diplomatic relations without strategic depth. C fails because military occupation relies solely on coercion, not diplomatic or economic integration. It risks condemnation, sanctions, and escalation, undermining relations rather than building sustainable influence. Regional free trade zones remove tariffs and quotas, facilitating the free flow of goods, services, and capital. They require shared rules and harmonized regulations, which fosters interdependence, mutual prosperity, and stable diplomatic relations. B fails because strategic tariffs represent protectionism and nationalism, creating trade barriers that trigger retaliation, fragment markets, and generate political friction, rather than cooperation. C fails because currency restrictions isolate countries from global financial integration, limiting participation in international capital flows, and opposing the principles of open markets and economic interdependence. Financial tools target financial systems, assets, and currency exchange to punish, deter, or compel behavioral change in another state. Currency sanctions that freeze assets cut off access to global financial markets and force policy concessions without military intervention. B fails because a customs union is an economic tool focused on trade liberalization and regional cooperation, not direct financial coercion or monetary manipulation. C fails because a joint defense pact is a national security tool that relies on military deterrence and force projection, involving no financial mechanism. Nationalization is a unilateral sovereign decision made without international collaboration. After failed negotiations, it prioritizes national self-interest, asserting control over strategic resources, while contradicting principles of international investment protection and cooperation. B fails because nationalization is unilateral and destabilizing, whereas multilateral coordination requires multiple countries working together through joint agreements to stabilize markets. C fails because seizing foreign assets destroys trust and increases political risk, representing the end of bilateral engagement, rather than its pursuit through incentives or negotiations. Topic: Geopolitical risk and the investment process. Which of the following best exemplifies an event risk that could significantly influence global financial markets? A scheduled referendum on a country's membership in a trade bloc. B. A prolonged period of economic sanctions on an exporting nation. C. Rising tensions between two neighboring countries over resource access. Which of the following best exemplifies an exogenous risk that could disrupt global financial stability? A gradual increase in corporate debt levels over 5 years. B. A sudden cyber attack on a major international payment system. C. A government's planned implementation of new banking regulations. Which of the following statements best characterizes how geopolitical uncertainty influences market and economic outcomes? The anticipation of geopolitical conflict often produces stronger negative market reactions than the conflict itself. B. Actual geopolitical events typically have a greater long-term economic effect than their anticipation. C. Investors generally increase capital spending and risk exposure during periods of heightened geopolitical tension. Which of the following best represents a thematic geopolitical risk? A. Ongoing escalation of cyber threats targeting global infrastructure. B. A surprise government collapse following election disputes. C. A scheduled review of international trade tariff policies. A government unexpectedly announces a nationwide ban on a critical export commodity, causing immediate currency depreciation and equity losses. This event is best described as A. High-velocity geopolitical risk. B. A low-frequency geopolitical risk. C. A low-magnitude geopolitical risk. An investor considering exposure to an emerging market with rising geopolitical tensions would most appropriately expect A. An increase in risk premiums and greater return volatility. B. A decline in perceived risk and reduced volatility. C. No significant change in expected return or volatility. Event risk involves a specific, discrete, and time-bound occurrence, with a known date but uncertain outcome. A scheduled referendum on trade bloc membership has a binary outcome, with broad, immediate implications for markets, concentrating risk around the event date. B fails because a prolonged period of sanctions is a chronic or thematic risk, not event risk. Markets adjust gradually over time. Only the initial imposition of sanctions would qualify as event risk. C fails because rising tensions describe a gradual process where risk builds incrementally. Only a specific action, such as a sudden military strike, would constitute event risk. Ongoing tension itself does not. Exogenous risks are sudden, unanticipated external shocks that originate outside the economic, political, or financial system. A cyber attack on a major international payment system is unpredictable in timing and target, can instantly disrupt markets and liquidity, and originates from outside the financial system. A. Fails because a gradual increase in corporate debt is an endogenous or thematic risk that arises from internal system dynamics, is observable over time, and is predictable, rather than a sudden external shock. C fails because planned implementation of new regulations is an event risk or policy risk that stems from internal government decision, making on a scheduled timeline, allowing markets to prepare in advance. Research using the Geopolitical Risk Index shows that the anticipation or threat of geopolitical conflict often triggers sharper negative market reactions than the actual event itself. Investors and firms dislike ambiguity more than confirmed bad news, leading to delayed investment and flight to safety during periods of rising tension. B fails because the sustained period of anticipation often has a more damaging long-term impact on economic variables, like capital expenditure, than the actual event. Confirmed events allow markets to price in the new reality and adjust. C fails because heightened geopolitical tension increases risk aversion, not risk-taking. Investors reduce capital spending, cut equity exposure, and shift to safe haven assets due to uncertainty. Thematic risks are long-term, evolving, and persistent trends that affect multiple sectors and nations over years. Ongoing cyber threats represent a fundamental shift in warfare and require strategic, long-term planning, rather than tactical responses. B fails because a surprise government collapse is an event risk or exogenous shock, with concentrated effects in time and space, lacking the slow-burning, systemic nature of thematic risks. C fails because a scheduled tariff review is a policy event with a known date and scope, fitting event risk rather than thematic risk. Thematic risks are long-term, evolving, broad in impact, and require strategic management. Event risks are short-term, discrete, limited in scope, and managed through tactical responses. Exogenous risks are unpredictable external shocks with high-velocity impact. Velocity is the speed at which a geopolitical event unfolds and impacts financial markets. The unexpected announcement triggered immediate currency depreciation and equity losses, with no delay between the event and market reaction, which defines high-velocity risk. B fails because frequency refers to how often an event occurs, not the speed of impact. The question focuses on the immediate market reaction, not whether the event is rare or common. C fails because magnitude refers to the severity of impact, not speed. The event caused significant currency depreciation and equity losses, indicating high magnitude, not low. A high-velocity event can have either high or low magnitude. Rising geopolitical tensions increase systematic risk, prompting investors to demand higher compensation, risk premium, and causing greater price volatility due to unpredictable shocks, such as sudden policy changes or currency devaluations. B fails because rising tensions increase perceived risk, not decrease it. Investors would withdraw capital rather than expect calmer markets when uncertainty is high. C fails because financial markets are highly sensitive to political risk. Investors price risk into returns, so rising tensions must affect expected returns and volatility. Ignoring this would be irrational.